So I'm going to start off. Thank you, everybody. Sorry about the all the technical difficulties, but I think I'll just start off by playing a quick game, and hopefully this is going to work. If it doesn't work, we'll figure something else out. Can you see my browser window?
Yeah. Let's make a deal. Monty
Let's make a deal. Yeah. So a lot of you out there have probably seen this before. So if anybody out there has seen this, please do not spoil it for those of you who haven't, because I know this can be a fairly popular game, but we're going to talk about it a little bit differently than maybe how people have in the past. For those of you not familiar with this game, there's a game show you may or may not have heard of. It's called Let's Make a Deal. I believe there is a version of this in Germany. I think you guys would have to tell me. But the purpose of the game is...
It is Geh aufs Ganze.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say. The purpose of this game is, on the stage, there are 3 closed doors, much like what you see here. Behind one of these closed doors is a brand new car. Behind each of the other 2 closed doors is a goat, as you can see from the instructions, on this page. And the objective of the game is very, very simple. Right? If you choose the door that has the brand new car, you win the car. I suppose if you choose the door that has the goat, I guess you get to have the goat. I don't know. I've never really asked that or really found out that, but I imagine you could have the goat if you really, really wanted it. But hopefully we are going to win a car. So this is the game setup. And if you ever watch Let's Make a Deal in America, run by a guy by the name of Monty Hall, or at least it was created by a guy by the name of Monty Hall, and that's why this is kind of known as the Monty Hall problem. This is what that game will look like. So if I can maybe ask somebody from the audience, or maybe one of you two guys, but somebody from the audience who has not, and I want to be clear about this, who has not played this game before. If somebody could please tell me, but behind one of these 3 closed doors, which one of them, 1, 2, or 3, has the car? Do we get some feedback from the audience?
Yeah, we have to wait for the latency.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Oh, there they come.
I'm willing to wait. Okay. What was the first answer?
Oh, they're just talking about the sound that we're up and running again.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a little bit of latency.
Okay, so everyone, what do you think? Number 3 is the first one.
Number 3? Okay, may I have the name of the person who's number 3?
It's Silvio.
Is that? I'm sorry?
Silvio.
I'm sorry. I apologize if I'm probably making a hash of that name. But so number 3 is the choice. So what you're going to see here is, because door number 3 was picked, I'm about to go click on door number 3. Now, when I do go click on door number 3, what you will see is that one of the other 2 doors, either door number 1 or door number 2, is going to open, revealing where one of the goats is. Or one of the goats is. Got to make sure I have my English right. Yeah. So let's try that. The most dangerous words in the English language are watch this. So let's try this. Let's watch this. We're going to click on door number 3, and you can see, yes, door number 2 has opened and revealing one of the goats. So this is where the Let's Make a Deal part of Let's Make a Deal comes in, is the person who chose door number 3. I'm going to give you this one-time only chance, this one-time only opportunity to, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, change your answer. So given the fact that you chose door number 3, and given the fact that I opened a door number 2 and showed you there's a goat behind door number 2, do you want to change your answer now and say, nope, I don't think the car is behind door number 3, I think it's behind door number 1? Or do you want to stick with your original answer, which is door number 3? What do you, whoever said door number 3, what do you think? Are you going to switch, or are you going to stay?
This goes up to you, Silvio. Do you want to switch or stay? I stay. He stays by 3.
He's going to stay. Okay, great. And the rest of you who are watching this, again, hopefully those of you who haven't seen this before, think about what you would do, right? Would you switch, or would you stay? And why? Why you potentially made the choice that you did. You'll have to wait till the end of the presentation to find out the right answer, because obviously if I show it to you now, then all of you would leave and then we would never hear from you again. So I'll come back to this, but make a mental note. All of you out there, everybody out there in YouTube land, make a mental note. What would you do? Would you stay or would you switch? So let's go back to our presentation. If I can do this right now. Present window, this one. Share, good. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay. Is that?
Yep. Works.
Okay. So what we just did was the Monte Hall problem. That was that. When we left off last time, there really wasn't a last time, but if you would have seen a presentation before this one, there was a question I asked. Again, you probably haven't seen this, but what does a 19th century Yorkshire cotton industrialist have to do with the Manhattan Project? All of you out there have Google. I'm going to come back to this answer here a little bit later in the presentation, or come back to this question a little bit later in the presentation. So I want you to give me your answer to that as well. So I'm giving you all kinds of homework you didn't expect to show up to this talk and have some homework. Now, did you? It's a bit cliched, but when we talk about forecasting, because the title of this presentation is when will it be done, or your project behaves like a hurricane, forecast it like one. Whenever we're talking about forecasting, the forecast that most people are just most familiar with is obviously weather forecasting. Now, a lot of you probably know about the geography of the Earth. At least I can say this in Germany. In America, the Americans aren't really so, they really don't know geography too much. We don't really know much in America either. But a lot of you probably know that in the Southern Atlantic, this area of the Southern Atlantic that I've highlighted here is very, very prone to storm activity. And especially between, say, June and November, we're at the tail end of it right now, but between June and November, storms that develop in this part of the world tend to track to the west and to the north based on the prevailing winds of that area. And these storms that track to the west and to the north usually become, as they're tracking west and north, become bigger and bigger and bigger storms that turn into these things called hurricanes. And you can see that something that develops here, if it tracks to the west and to the north, has a pretty good likelihood of hitting what is known as the East Coast of the United States. So you can imagine that the United States has a very vested interest in understanding these storms that develop. Are they going to turn into hurricanes? And if they turn into hurricanes, are they going to hit the U.S.? Just for reference, by the way, Dan lives right there. So you can imagine that Dan has a very, very, extremely interested in this as well. By the way, this is a picture of my first brush with a hurricane. Now, this was a storm that actually didn't even hit Florida. It stayed about 100 miles off the coast of Florida. But the winds were still strong enough in our part of the state that it knocked down trees and knocked down fences and things like that. So you can imagine something like this got my attention very, very, very quickly. But I'm not going to talk about this particular storm. I want to go all the way back to October 22nd, 2012. And there was a storm that formed in the Southern Caribbean. Okay. And the United States has a government agency known as the National Hurricane Center, or NHC, the National Hurricane Center, that's responsible for tracking these storms and providing forecasts for these storms. And so whenever one of these storms form, the NHC will put out one of these graphics right here. And a lot of you have maybe seen something like this before. Now, what's interesting about this one is you'll see that this particular storm, it was so early in its formation that it didn't even have a name yet. It's called Tropical Depression 18. So everybody knows that when storms become big enough, they get names and whatever. But unless like this year, there are so many storms that you run out of names. We literally ran out of names this year because there were so many storms. But that's a different conversation. So this is called Tropical Depression 18. As you can see, it formed on Monday, October 22nd, and the National Hurricane Center puts out this graphic. Okay. Now, that particular storm grew to be the largest hurricane ever seen in the Atlantic, ever, well, in recorded history anyway, since we've been tracking these things. So in the 150 years or so since we've been tracking this, it was the largest hurricane, largest as measured by diameter, right? Just pure size of the storm, pure width of the storm. Does anybody out there happen to know its name? If you had to guess, so this is 2012, largest hurricane ever. Does anybody know? Then can anybody chat the name of this storm?
Without Googling, I guess.
Without, well, yeah, I suppose you can Google if you want to, but yeah.
So what's the name?
Hopefully people
asking the audience.
Does anybody have any thoughts?
Katarina is the first.
Okay. Oh, Katrina. Yeah, Katrina. Katrina's a good guess. It's not Katrina. That's a really good guess, but it's not Katrina. No. Are there any others?
Yeah, a lot of Katrinas.
Yeah, maybe you guys didn't hear about this one, but this one was actually called Hurricane Sandy. In fact, it was so big. This storm was so big. It was later called Superstorm Sandy. So maybe this didn't make as much news in Europe as it did here in America. But this thing was huge. This hurricane was huge. Like I said, it was the largest hurricane ever. It was the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history at the time. Anyway, it was the second costliest in U.S. history. Second only to Katrina, which is why I think a lot of people think it's Katrina. But here's the big one. It affected 24 states. And of course, we can't forget our friends in Canada, although as much as we'd like to, we can't forget about them. Affected 24 states, with Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey suffering most of the damage. So 24 states. Usually when hurricanes hit, they'll affect 2, 3, maybe 4 states at the most. Hurricane Sandy hit 24 states. And the question is, would you have guessed any of that just by looking at this picture? And my guess is probably not, that you wouldn't. There's one other very, very, very important fact about Sandy that we can't lose sight of. And that was that there was surprisingly little loss of life. With all those statistics that I just put up, you would expect there to be a lot of casualties, and there simply weren't. Now, obviously, any loss of life is tragic, and I'm not trying to minimize or trivialize anybody who lost their life in this. But if we're talking about this huge storm that hits all these states and does all this damage, you would expect there to be lots of deaths associated with that, and there just weren't, which I think means that the National Hurricane Center knows a little something about forecasting. Right, that we had enough warning about this thing that we were able to do something about it. So let's talk about what the National Hurricane Center knows that we don't. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this picture specifically. What's going on in this picture? And my guess is when you first look at this picture, your eye is drawn, or should be, no pun intended, by the way, your eye should be drawn to this you see the white shaped cone in the center? Now, a lot of people, when they see this, they think that cone represents the size of the storm. They think that represents kind of the path of destruction for the storm itself, and that's actually not strictly true. In fact, it's not really true at all. Some of you may have noticed this black box with white text at the top of the picture. Here, I'm going to blow it up for you so you can read what it says. It says, note, the cone contains the probable, that's my emphasis, by the way, probable path of the storm center, just the storm center, but does not show the size of the storm. Hazardous conditions can occur outside of the cone. So that's all this cone is showing us. Oops, I just gave you the answer. All this cone is showing us, if I go back to this one, is the possible path of the storm center. Now, you guys know these storms are huge, so that means there can be all kinds of destruction outside of this, but it's just showing the path of the center. Now, when I highlighted probable, my question is, when I was first looking at this, it's like, what does probable really mean? And when we're talking about hurricane forecasting, I mean, this is literally life and death. I mean, no joke. It is literally life and death. Whether we get this hurricane forecast right or wrong can mean the difference between somebody living and dying. So when they say probable, in my head, I was expecting that probability to be pretty high, But if you go and you look and you read what the National Hurricane Center puts out, it's saying there's just a 60 to 70% chance that the center of the storm will be located within that cone. Right. Honestly, that shocked me a little bit. That seemed a little small, but to be honest with you, it's fairly remarkable that we even get that high to give National Hurricane Center its props. But the question is, why not 100%? 60 to 70%, really? Why can't you tell me with 100% certainty where that cone is going to go. And as many of you probably know, forecasting the weather, specifically forecasting hurricanes, is very, very, very complicated stuff. There's all kinds of variables that go into this forecast, right? Wind speed, wind direction, whether the storm interacts with land or not, water temperature, whether there are other storms in the area, right? There are all kinds of other variables that come into play. So for the National Hurricane Center to give a 100% forecast, a probability for 100% probability forecast, that size of that cone would essentially be Earth, right? It would be the whole globe. That's the only way that you would go 100. It would be the cone would be so big as to be not useful to anybody. The point here is that weather forecasting is uncertain. Everybody knows this. Therefore, you can't think deterministically. And what I mean by that is there's no such thing as 100%. We talk about weather forecasting, or any forecasting for that matter. You cannot think in terms of 100%. You have to think probabilistically. What are our chances? Obviously that are not 100%. Oops. Let me go to that. This is but the problem with thinking probabilistically, as maybe some of you encountered with the Monty Hall problem. The problem with thinking probabilistically is that humans aren't very good at thinking probabilistically. We're just really, really, really not. We're not programmed for it. And so that means we have to have a pretty good working definition of thinking probabilistically. And to me, this is the best definition that I've come across, is really thinking probabilistically means acknowledging there is more than one possible future outcome. Right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's all kinds of possible outcomes in the future. We don't know which one's going to happen, but each one of those has a risk associated with it, or a chance associated with it. So in Hurricane Sandy's case, as some of you know, the National Hurricane Center runs all kinds of simulations. And so each one of the lines on this particular map right here represents one of those possible paths, a future forecast of Sandy. And from these paths, that's what they do. They aggregate these together, and that's how they come up with that cone, right? Here's a good example of that. These are called spaghetti models, by the way, in case anyone's wondering and you want to Google this. This is called spaghetti models, but this is what they do. They run simulations, and they run all kinds of different simulations to find out, okay, hey, what's going to how are we going to model this so that we know what's going to happen in the future, and how do we come up with a risk associated with those future outcomes? So the question then becomes, well, was this the only forecast that the National Hurricane Center made? Right? So remember, it's Monday, October 22nd. The storm shows up. The National Hurricane Center puts out this forecast. Is that it? Is their job done? Right? Let me give a better example of this. So this is the very next day. Hopefully everybody can see down in the bottom left corner here. This is now Tuesday, October 23rd. This is now 24 hours later from that first forecast. Tuesday, October 23rd. Imagine if the National Hurricane Center stopped here. Imagine if they said, okay, you know what? Here's your forecast. We're going to go home now. We're going to take a long weekend, actually maybe go on holiday. See you guys next year. Right? Imagine if this is the only forecast that they ever made. How would you feel right now if you're looking at this, if you lived in New York, Pennsylvania, or New Jersey? I remember I said those three states were the ones that had hit the hardest. If you look at this picture, you're probably thinking, wow, this storm looks like it's heading off into the Atlantic. Looks like it might even be weakening. I don't really have anything to worry about. This is probably going to go to the beach this weekend, maybe have a barbecue, do something, right? A week later, this is what Sandy looked like. Right? Notice you can't even see New York, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania, right? I mean, the storm is so big. So the idea here is that the National Hurricane Center is constantly updating their forecasts as they get new information. They don't ever say at the beginning of the forecast, well, here's a plan, and this is the plan, and the hurricane's going to stick to this plan because that's the forecast we made, right? That's not how it works. every few hours, the National Hurricane Center is getting all new information. They're getting information about those variables I was mentioning, wind speed, wind direction, all of these things. And as they get that new information, they incorporate it into their models, they rerun the simulations, and they update their forecasts, right? This next slide is probably my favorite slide in the whole presentation, where I'm going to show you this time lapse of all the forecasts that the National Hurricane Center put out for Sandy. So, I mean, you can see, just kind of in nice graphical motion, how the forecast updates over time. And you can see how it looks like the hurricane's going to fly off into the Atlantic, and then it takes that sharp left turn and just nails New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, right? So this is that idea of forecasting is, as you get more information, you need to update your forecast, and we'll come back to that one in a second too. The last thing I want to mention is, what else is happening in this picture? The final piece of the puzzle, maybe not the final, but one of the final pieces of the puzzle is note the time frame. You notice how it gets a forecast from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we're only talking about 3-4 days here. And you might be thinking, well, 3 or 4 days, how useful is that? Why isn't it giving me 3 or 4 weeks? Why isn't it giving me 3 or 4 months? And again, if we want to forecast 3 or 4 months into the future of where this hurricane may be, we're looking at a cone that might be the size of Earth. So kind of putting this all together, the National Hurricane Center fundamentally understands some basic principles of forecasting that my guess is that you do not. When I say you, I mean organizations out there, maybe not you personally, but organizations out there simply do not understand these principles. Number one, you have to think probabilistically and not deterministically. No such thing as 100% here. There's no such thing. Anybody who tells you there's 100% is selling you something, right? No such thing. Number two, you have to update your forecasts as you get more information. This is something that I call continuous forecasting. It's a hashtag I'm trying to get trending on Twitter, hashtag continuous forecasting, but it doesn't seem to want to trend or whatever, even though it's so super important. You need to update your forecast as you get more information. And then in general, shorter term forecasts are better than longer term ones. This doesn't mean that you can't forecast far out into the future. No, absolutely. You can forecast out as far out as you want to. You just can't be upset when that forecast turns out to be wrong, right? So in general, shorter term forecasts are better than longer term ones. Think about this. Are these 3 basic principles that you're incorporating into all of your forecasts? My guess is probably not. Most organizations, like I say, run into don't. So let's talk about, well, how do we apply these principles to our work? So the first one, thinking probabilistically, not deterministically. Well, what do we need to think probabilistically about? The thing that we need to think probabilistically about is the most important question that our customers are going to ask us. It's the only one that they care about, and that is the question, when will it be done? This is, I don't want to say it's the only thing, but you probably know once you start working on something for your customer, this is the first question they're going to ask you, and they're going to keep asking you this question until that project or that feature or that whatever is delivered. When will it be done? They want an answer to the question of when will it be done in a date or a number of days. There's a very specific form of the answer they want. It's a date or number of days, and it's even worse than that. They want that date or number of days to be in terms of elapsed time, right? They're not sitting there thinking, well, nobody really works over the weekends and nobody really works over holidays and, whatever. They're not thinking that way. If you tell them something's going to be done in 30 days, they think it's going to be done in 30 days, right? That's how they're thinking about the world. They're not thinking in terms of story points and velocity. But again, that's a whole other talk. But anybody who thinks you can do this kind of forecasting in story points and velocity, you're sorely mistaken. I'm sorry to say it that way, but you are. So predictability is the accuracy to which we can answer that question, when will it be done, using the language of our customer. So what I mean by that is if our customer is looking for an answer in terms of elapsed time, that's exactly how we have to communicate our forecast to them. We have to communicate it to them in terms of elapsed time. So how do we answer when will it be done? Remember I said thinking probabilistically means acknowledging that there's more than one possible future outcome. Everybody remembers that, I'm sure. So as a real world example, let's say we started a project and have completed 12 stories in 1 week. Okay. Let's further say that we have 120 stories left to complete in our backlog. When will this project be finished? Take a second and think about traditionally, if you had this data, traditionally, how would you answer that question? Hey, we're getting 12 stories done a week. We've got 120 stories left. How long is that going to take us to get our project done? Most people would probably take that 120, they divide it by 12, and they would say 10 weeks, right? That's the answer that they would come up with. The vast majority of people, especially traditional, kind of more traditional project planning, project management type techniques, would just take 120 divided by 12 and come up with that answer 10 weeks. There are all kinds of problems with that approach. Hopefully you've been paying attention up until now, and there were all kinds of problems with that approach. Two of which are attributable to the fact that 120 divided by 12, you're actually calculating an average. Right? Whether you know it or not, that's what you're doing. You're calculating an average. So some more homework for you. We're not going to get into this too much, but you need to read this book called The Flaw of Averages by Dr. Sam Savage. Probably the most important book on forecasting. I don't know that he would necessarily say this is a book about forecasting. He probably would. But the most important book, as far as I'm concerned, about forecasting, The Flaw of Averages. And the good news is you only really need to read the first half of the book. You don't need to read the whole thing. But the basic premise, I'm going to spoil the punchline for you. The basic premise of this book is that plans based on average fail on average. So plans based on average fail on average. So you do that 120 divided by 12, we've calculated an average of 10 weeks. That means we have an average chance that 10 weeks, we have an average chance of being wrong. I guess it's your customers don't want you to be wrong an average amount of time. What's even worse than that, though, is when you say 10 weeks, your customers are thinking 10 weeks. Well, it's going to be exactly 10 weeks, right? We haven't communicated any information. We haven't communicated any information about risk. And remember, this is something that the National Hurricane Center understands very, very well. So remember, they published this cone right here. What this cone is telling us is these are all the possible future outcomes. Well, not all of them. These are most of the possible future outcomes. We have this range of possible future outcomes. And remember, I said there's a 60 to 70% chance that the storm center is going to go here. So what they're doing is they're communicating that risk as part of their forecast. So whenever you communicate a forecast, you should communicate your forecast that way too. All your forecast should have, at a minimum, two parts: a range of possible outcomes and a probability associated with that range of possible outcomes. Right? It's very, 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 very simple. Remember, so this cone, range of outcomes, 67% chance we're going to fit within that range. So now you're thinking to yourself, hopefully you've come back to a question. This is the question that should be foremost in your mind as I'm going through this, right? Everybody remember this one? This is what you're thinking about right now, right? What does the 19th century Yorkshire cotton industrialists have to do with the Manhattan Project? Did anybody happen to Google that? I don't know if anybody came up with an answer to this question. It's rather obscure. It doesn't surprise me. It would not surprise me if nobody did come up with an answer.
It seems so.
So the answer to this question is, of course, Monte Carlo. The way that we are in our world, I should say the way, one way that we can come up with a forecast that communicates a range of possible outcomes and a probability associated with those outcomes is to do something called a Monte Carlo forecast. Now, there's no way that we have time to go into what Monte Carlo is and how to do it and all that. We just don't. Maybe some point in the future I'll get invited back and we can do a deep dive into the mechanics of Monte Carlo. But for now, we'll have to think about Monte Carlo another way. And this is where we come back to the Monty Hall problem. So let's switch over. I'm going to switch over to the Monty Hall problem again. If I can get this right, I can share that, and hopefully, can everybody see my screen? Hopefully, yes.
Yep. Works.
Okay, good. Excellent. So when we left off, remember we had somebody choose door number 3. I revealed door number 2, and I gave them an opportunity to go back and say, hey, do you want to change your answer or not? And the individual said, no, I'm going to stick with door number 3. Well, what is, thinking about this now, based on everything that I've just told you, what is one way that we might answer this question? What's one way that we might come up with the best strategy, whether we switch or not? I don't know if anybody can suggest in just a couple words in the chat, what's one way that we might know how to play this game, what the best strategy is?
We are waiting for the audience.
Okay. Think about think about it this way. Like if you flip a coin, what are your chances of getting heads? And how do you know? How do you know your chances are what, most people say, well, of course it's 50%. Well, how do you know?
Silvio just replied and sent data from the history.
Data, yeah, that's exactly right. What we could do is we could take this game and we could play it over and over and over and over and over again, and we can track the results. We can track the results from when we switched and if we won, and we can track the results when we didn't switch and if we won. And we can tally all those, we can tally all of those results to find out what is our best chance. Believe it or not, that's all a Monte Carlo simulation is. So I'm gonna show you this. This website is actually a Monte Carlo simulation. So I'm going to remember we had picked door number 3, and we said, hey, we're going to stick with door number 3. So I'm going to click on door number 3 again, and you're going to see, unfortunately, we lose. But you'll see down here. Notice everything down here. It's actually tabulating that historical data for us, and you'll see those times where the player switched won about 2/3 of the time, and those times where the player didn't switch, in this case, the player didn't switch, only won 1/3 of the time. This is really, honestly, this is all a Monte Carlo simulation is. Don't get hung up. I know a lot of people, when they hear Monte Carlo simulation, they think it's really fancy mathematical technique. It really isn't. All it is you run the experiment over and over and over again, and you just track the results. And so this tells us, we have 2 possible outcomes in the future, and for each possible outcome, we have the chance of being right. Now, know what this means. So this is very, very important, because what this means is even though switching is the better strategy, that doesn't mean that you're going to win when you switch every single time. That doesn't mean that you're going to lose if you don't switch every single time. But what this does tell us is we have twice as great a chance of winning if we switch than if we don't switch. Over the long term, the much better strategy is to switch and not to switch. And again, maybe, I can't get into, there's a reason why this is. And if anybody wants to understand it or talk about it, we can maybe talk about it later. But that
was in my mind. What's the evidence behind it? But let's go.
Well, maybe for later. I'll finish up my talk, and then we can maybe talk about that. But just know that Monte Carlo, whether we understand the mathematics behind this, and we probably don't. By the way, we probably don't understand. So whether we understand the mathematics or not, the Monte Carlo simulation gives us irrefutable evidence of what the best strategy is. And that's the power of Monte Carlo simulation, and that's why we need to, consider that as part of our toolbox in terms of coming up with our probabilistic forecasting. So just to kind of finish out, so that's the think probabilistically, not deterministically. Use things like probabilistic forecasting. Then there is, remember this slide. Mm-hmm. This is that hashtag I was telling you about, continuous forecasting. Now that we have something like Monte Carlo simulation in our toolbox, it's going to be very, very easy for us to update that model and update those simulations as we get more information. As your project is being worked, you're getting all kinds of new information. You're getting information about maybe better requirements. You're getting better information about how fast the team is going. You're getting better information about maybe what the customer thinks is valuable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to take all that information, just like the National Hurricane Center does, and incorporate it into our forecast, and constantly update our forecasts as we get that new information. I can use this example. I'll just talk about it very, very quickly. I can use this example because in Europe, you understand football. In America, we don't understand football. But in Europe, you guys understand football. And this is the round of 16 from the last World Cup. Belgium and Japan. And there are websites out there, many of you have probably seen this, there are websites out there that while the game is being played in real time, they will update the forecast in terms of who's going to win, in terms of probabilities. And this red shaded area was the chance that Belgium is going to win, and this blue shaded area was the chance that Japan was going to win. And you can see throughout the full first half, Belgium was an overwhelming favorite. And then right after the first half, you see Japan jumped up. And then Japan jumped up again. And if anybody remembers this game, you remember that right after the first half, Japan scored a goal and then scored another goal. And Japan went up 2-0 right after halftime. So, of course, if Japan is up 2-0 right after halftime, their chances of winning that game go up dramatically. And that's why you see here, until about halfway through the second half, Japan's chances go down. And then they go down again, and then finally they go down to 0. And you remember that Belgium scored three consecutive goals to actually win that game. But this is a classic example of continuous forecasting. Hopefully the European Championships will be played next year, which we all know Italy is going to win, right? Everybody knows that. I mean, they might as well just hand the trophy to them right now. I don't even know why Germany's even going to bother showing up. Right? Mm-hmm. Right? No, yeah. Yeah.
Don't talk about that.
We're going to get all kinds of hate mail now.
Yeah.
But hopefully the European Championships will be played next year, and there'll be sites like this where we can actually test continuous forecasting in real practice. Just so you know, this is an example from a company that I'm working with right now. They have a dashboard. This dashboard gets updated every 15 minutes. In terms of teams and their chances of hitting a release date. Again, if anybody wants to go over this in a little bit more detail, but all this data is collected in Jira. We pull all this data out of Jira. We run the Monte Carlo simulations in the background, and every 15 minutes it's being updated in terms of a team's chance of hitting their release date. And so if their chances drop below a certain threshold, then we get together and we talk about, okay, what has changed? What has changed about the path of the hurricane that we need to do something else? Do we need to cut scope? Do we need to change the date? Do we need to what do we need to do to get our chances back up to where they need to be, right? And then, of course, shorter term forecasts are better than longer term ones. That's fairly self-explanatory. Remember, the National Hurricane Center, they're only forecasting out 3-4 days in advance. Believe it or not, I would say this is probably the biggest reason why Scrum as a framework exists, is because Scrum recognized that in complex environments, it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to forecast out more than, say, 30 days in advance or even 2 weeks in advance. And so they said, okay, instead of putting together these project plans that are 18 months long, 2 years long, let's just talk about what we can get done in the next 30 days or less, the next 2 weeks or less. That's really their whole, from my perspective, that's really their whole justification for existing. And they're exactly right? We have a much better chance of being right talking about what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks than we do talking about what's going to happen in the next 2 years, right? I don't have time for this. I'm just going to fast forward through all of that. I'm not even sure why it's still in there. I should take it out. So remember, we can use Monte Carlo simulation with historical throughput as an input to come up with our set of possible outcomes. Always communicate your forecast in terms of a range and a probability. Update your forecast as you get more information. And when possible, favor short-term forecasts over longer-term ones. So please remember continuous forecasting. Remember, put that hashtag out there on Twitter. Help me out a little bit. My Twitter handle's at the bottom of every slide. Hopefully everybody saw that. And obviously, most importantly, the best forecasts in the world are useless, unless you take action. When Belgium was down 2-0 against Japan, do you think that the same game plan they had going into that match was held to, right? Or did they change tactics? Did they change, whatever? My guess is they changed quite a bit. Two of the best references on these things written by the world's best author ever on these topics. There's a book called When Will It Be Done? There's also a book called Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. The dashboard that I just showed you, that kind of project dashboard that I showed you, where there are all the probabilities and everything. It's a case study from InfoQ called Ultimate Kanban. So if you just Google Ultimate Kanban InfoQ, you will find that case study, and that's in a little bit more detail. So hopefully I sped through that fast enough.
Wow.
Is there other
Awesome.
questions?